want to pay attention to what's going on in our world, but as we've talked about before, we really want to pay attention to our brothers and sisters in the faith. And in our church here in Syracuse, we talked the last couple weeks, we've talked about the Bible's idea of justice. We had Steve Kennard that we watched the video from last Wednesday. We talked about acknowledging our anger and what the Bible says anger is useful for and is not useful for on Sunday. And so tonight, we want to better understand some of the, as best we can in the time that we have allowed, some of the pain our Black brothers and sisters are going through. Where is that coming from? And you know, in the Bible, in 1 Corinthians chapter 8, Paul tells us, now about food sacrificed to idols, we know that we all possess knowledge. Knowledge puffs up, but love builds up. The man who thinks he knows something does not yet know as he ought to know. But the man who loves God is known by God. Chapter 8 is not about food, but it's about loving our brothers who are different. And the Bible says there that knowledge puffs up, but love builds up. We don't want to talk about all the things we know or we think we know. The Bible even says here that a man thinks he knows something, but he doesn't yet know what he ought to know. And that's the way we actually go through this life many times. Later on in 1 Corinthians chapter 12, goes on to talk about the church, the body of Christ, and how we can't do without brothers and sisters who are different from us. And in verse 26, Paul talks about the connectedness that all of us are supposed to have together. He says that we are integral to each other, so much so that if one part suffers, every part suffers with it. And if one part is honored, every part rejoices with it. Right now, in our body, we have a part that's suffering. They understand their suffering all too well. They've been very educated on it in many cases, not every case, but in many cases. Experience, education and higher learning. Some of us understand their suffering, but we don't understand why. And you know what? One of the comforts I take from 1 Corinthians 8 here is that we don't have to know why, but we do have to love. Because knowledge can puff up, but the role of love in our hearts and in our body is to build one another up, to be connected. So tonight is about loving God. It's about understanding one another, because as different as we all are, we are all part of the same body, part of God's household. Now, my role here is I'm a preacher, I'm a minister, and God's word is not just useful now, but it's always useful. But God has given us many parts in the body, and in our body, we're blessed to have Dr. Jamila Michener. And I'm introducing her to us tonight as Dr. Jamila Michener, who has not only the Holy Spirit, but she has a heart and a mind and a passion for research and understanding these very issues. I shared earlier that I went to a site about Jamila and some of what she's done, and she has a list of bona fides or qualifications that's longer than both of my arms put together. It's pages and pages long. We know that she's a professor at Cornell, but she has her bachelor's degree from Princeton, a PhD is from University of Chicago. She has literally written a book about inequality called Fragmented Democracy, Medicaid, Federalism, and Unequal Politics. If you watch WCNY, our local PBS station, she's often a guest commentator on the Ivory Tower Friday evening. So if you haven't watched Jamila and listened to Jamila, do so, and you'll see her in some of her professional capacity there. She is a very sought-after speaker on the topic that we get to have her with us tonight about. She's also a great wife, a great mother, an intensely committed disciple of Jesus, and a great friend to me and Shyla. I'm so grateful that we asked her to speak and that she said yes, and that she's going to take time to teach us tonight. She is an educator on this topic. She's going to teach us tonight and answer some of our questions. So please do listen attentively. Have a notepad. If you're a texter, text your questions. This will be a time where you can really understand others and understand some of these very important questions right now. So without further ado, Dr. Jamila Michener.
Okay, I'm unmuted now. I'm going to share my screen. Okay, can you all see that? Is it sharing? All right. Sorry. I'm going to expand this out so I can see too. Okay, I'm going to. All right, there we go. That's better. Okay, so I am so happy to be able to share with all of you tonight. It's so weird and different. I'm in front of classrooms all the time, and I'm with you guys all the time, but those things are usually completely separate. So this will be interesting for me, but more so than that, I think there's so much happening right now in the world, and it's so painful, and to so many people, it's confusing. And I'm just grateful that we're taking this time to really talk about it and learn, and really take it seriously and not bypass the opportunity to grow as a result of what's happening in the world right now. So I called this Grace and Truth. I was thinking about calling it something super academic. I wouldn't give an academic talk usually and call it Grace and Truth. But this isn't an academic talk, even though I'm going to draw on my knowledge from the academic world. And I even actually took some of the slides from different lectures that I give. It's different, and it's different because we're thinking about it as a group of believers together, right? So we have some different tools that we can bring to bear on addressing these really hard topics. And grace and truth are two of those tools. And I think I'll be honest that I'm going to focus more on the truth part today than I am on the grace part. But I wanted to at least start with grace and truth, and with the understanding that even as we grapple with and try to understand how to respond to difficult truths that are now ravaging literally our country and our world, we should still hold on to grace. And that's actually something that I struggle with a lot, which is why I highlight it, because it's as much for myself as it is for any other purpose. And you know, I'm really like, I turn to this scripture in John 1:14 often and just think about how Jesus came full of grace and truth. And that is an inspiration to me. And I can very easily veer towards, you know, telling it like it is, telling the truth. And when I write up all my teaching statements, it's always like, well, you know, discomfort is a form of pedagogy, and you tell the truth, you make people uncomfortable. And I'm very comfortable with that, but the grace part is crucial. So even as I get into some of the truths, I hope that we can remember that I'm also holding on to the grace here. So I just want to start with some basic things that, you know, we may already know. To some of us, it may be like, I know all of this, but we may not. And I think that these basic truths can help to kind of frame any conversation or any thinking that we might want to do about the topic of race, right? Which is really what is underlying the uprisings and the crisis unfolding in our country right now. So what is race? We may think that we know what it is, because it's the kind of thing where you know it when you see it. But it's a little bit more complicated than that. Race is a social classification system. And I want to say, I promise, is the only slide that will have a whole bunch of words. Everything after this won't. But it's a social classification system, and it's used to distinguish groups. We know that. It's one of the first things maybe we notice about somebody when we encounter them. Now, contemporarily, it's largely based on phenotype, right? So you look at me and you know I'm Black. Why? Because my skin is dark, and you know my hair is a different texture, and there are kind of phenotypical characteristics that indicate it. But it's interesting to note that the criteria for determining race has varied over time, right? Even in this country. So there are Supreme Court cases where the Supreme Court treats somebody who speaks a different language, who at the time from an Eastern European country or some part of the world that wasn't considered a part of the American polity, as though they're a different race before the law, even though they're phenotypically white. Similarly with religion, there's a really well-known Supreme Court case where there is a Muslim man who feels that he should be have the benefits of at that time in the country, the benefits of whiteness, and the court decides that on account of being Muslim, he wasn't in fact white. So we think about race as being solely phenotypical, but it's actually been a variety of different things over time, which really points to the fact that it's a historical and a social construct. It didn't exist before the 16th century. If you went back then, it's not that there weren't different hierarchies that determine different forms of difference and domination, but race, as we think about it and know it now, wouldn't have meant really anything to anyone before then. And what I say this for is to underscore that race doesn't have any biological basis. You can't actually genetically distinguish between racial groups. If you were to take my DNA and you were to take, J.C. Smith's DNA, and you were a geneticist and you analyzed our DNA, you probably wouldn't be able to tell what the racial differences between us were, notwithstanding all of those DNA tests that are advertised on TV that'll show you your entire background and ancestry. You cannot determinatively identify someone's race as we understand or think about that concept just based on their DNA. Race doesn't actually have a biological basis, and there are more genetic differences within racial groups than there are between them. So 85% of all human genetic variation is actually within racial groups. And so, race is something that we think of as this big dividing line between people, but it is a dividing line, but it's not because it's genetic or because it's biological. And it's important to say that, yes, racial categories sometimes correlate with biological traits, right? Like skin color or hair texture. Most of the times, the vast majority of the times, that's just superficial. And even when it's more than superficial, like there are particular diseases that certain population groups are more likely to get, it's never deterministic. It's never like this only happens to people who are Black, this only happens to people who are white. And that's really important because there are actually a lot of stereotypes. It's actually quite common for people to have stereotypes that there are real biological differences between racial groups. And then we can use those as a basis for explaining why people seem to behave differently or why they seem to have different life outcomes. And it's not the reason, right? So does that mean we can be like, oh, there is no race? It's just a social construct. It's just the human race. I don't see color, right? And these are a lot of the kinds of things that we can, or that people can say or think in a very well-meaning way. But that is misguided too, because there is race. It's not a biological construct, but it is a social fact. It's a social fact because it determines what happens to us in life, in reality, right? This hasn't always been true in the same way it is true now in contemporary American life. But in the United States, it's been true since even before we were the United States, right? So race is a social fact. So we can't just say, oh, race isn't real. It doesn't have a biological basis. I'll just ignore it. And how do we know it's a social fact? Because we see it in different outcomes in people's lives, right? If we take, for example, poverty, racial differences in rates of poverty persist. And we could go way back before 1989. We could take this graph back to the 1960s, which is about the time that we had this kind of data. And we'll see differences that persist. They ebb and flow, right? The kind of extent of these gaps is changing over time. And you might say, oh, this looks like things are getting better. But one thing to keep in mind is that the differences persist. And then depending on the metric you look at, the differences are growing. So if we switch from thinking about the kind of one end of the spectrum, poverty, and we go to the other end of the spectrum, wealth, then we can see over time, this has actually gotten worse, right? So the most recent data that we have from 2016 shows that on average, white families have 7 times as much wealth as Black families, right? And there's also a gap between white and Hispanic families. So race is a fact. It is expressed in outcomes in people's lives, right? And it shapes life trajectories. If we think about something like imprisonment, your likelihood of being imprisoned at some time in your life course is going to be dramatically different based on your race. If you're a Black man, you have a 1 in 3 chance at some point in your lifetime of being incarcerated. Just think about 3 people you know, and imagine that was the likelihood that one of those people, right? For Black people who have lots of family members and friends and people in their close social circles, this means that we're much more likely to, if we don't experience this ourselves, to know someone who has, and to be living with the consequences of what this means, right? And it's literally life and death. If we think about what's going on right now, we're in the middle of a global health pandemic. And in the United States, the consequences for Black Americans are dramatically different. The brunt of the burden of this virus is being borne by Black communities. And if you translate these numbers into lives lost, the most recent estimates suggest that 13,000 Black people would be alive today if they were being affected by COVID-19 at rates similar to those of white Americans, right? So it is literally life and death. And of course we know that, because that is what is at the root of the uprisings that we're seeing happen throughout the country right now. What's at the root of it is that George Floyd, he died. And he died in a way that was very public and that was very heinous, and that many people are upset and angry about. And many people believe that the determinative factor in his death was the fact that he was Black, that something like that wouldn't have happened if it weren't for him being Black. Now, you might think, well, we don't know that. We don't know what the cop was thinking. We don't know what is in their hearts and minds. And that's all true. But what we do know is that this is not an isolated incident, right? Black men on average are 2.5 times more likely to be killed by the police than white men in this country. And that's not just true for them. There's an increased likelihood for Black women, for Latino men, for American Indian men and women. People of color in this country are just more likely to die at the hands of the police. And one thing to point out, and I don't want to get too into the weeds right now, but one thing to point out, because I think it's really important, is that these differences persist even when we account for behavior, right? So we know things like Black people and white people in America use drugs at about the same rates. But Black people are dramatically more likely to end up arrested and in prison for drug use, right? So it's tempting to think, well, what are these people doing? Why is this happening to them? The police don't just go out and identify Black and brown people and murder them, right? Now, of course not. It's more complicated than that. But the answer isn't that there's something wrong with these people. There's something that they're doing that explains this behavior, right? And I'll talk about that just a little bit in a second. But I just want to emphasize that it's life and death. And that's why we keep talking about it so much, right? We might be at the point right now where we're like, oh my gosh, another midweek on this, or oh my gosh, another conversation about this. And every time you turn on the TV and it's just everything. Why is this so important? And part of the reason it's so important is because for so many people, it is literally life and death, right? But why does it matter so much? Why do we see these outcomes, right? There are a whole ton of reasons. I'm gonna just put some up on the screen here. I cannot explain all of these reasons to you. I teach an entire semester course on race. And in that semester, across that semester, we talk about all of these things on the screen right here and more, right? Some of these things you might know. Oh, slavery, I know what that is. And you might think of it as historical, it's something in the past. Some of these things you might not know, right? You're like, what's Jim Crow? What's redlining? And if you're interested in knowing, I'm happy to provide anyone with resources. But the fact of the matter is that these are parts of our social, economic, and political system that both historically and contemporarily have created significant disadvantages for people of color. And that is what explains differences in racial outcomes primarily. It's not about like, so you might think, oh, it's about culture. Maybe there's just, they don't work hard enough, or they don't have the same morals or values, or, oh, there are too many single parent homes and fathers aren't committed enough to their families. And there are actually a lot of stereotypical things that we hear, that we see in media, and that we can easily believe about what makes Black and Latino people different and explains differences in outcomes. And most of these things, social science research has debunked, right? And these things that are on the slide right here are the things that research really overwhelmingly shows explain these outcomes. And these are about systems and processes and not about individual people making bad choices. Does that mean that people don't make bad choices? No. Does it mean that sometimes Black people don't make bad choices that explain bad outcomes in their life? Of course they do, right? But these aggregate patterns, these wide scale disparities, those are not a product of just, well, I guess Black people make bad choices and have bad culture. They're not, right? The fact of the matter is, though, that there are deep divides over how we view these things. And when you ask white Americans, for example, and Black Americans to think about whether Black people are treated less fairly in various areas of life, in dealing with the police, by the criminal justice system, et cetera, there tend to be differences, and pretty substantial differences, depending on what area you look at, in opinions on these things. And those differences can divide us, right? If you think that this is not really a big deal, and I think that it is, you might not hear me when I'm talking about my experience. When this last one at the bottom, when seeking medical treatment, I won't get into it, but some of you, I know I've told my experience when Jace was born in the University of Chicago hospital, a hospital that is embedded in a very poor Black community. And the doctors there are used to very low-income Black women who aren't well-educated coming in. And they treat, I mean, my experience there was horrific. It was just, I couldn't even get into it, but anyone who wants to know can ask Justin, because he won't get as upset telling the story. But if I'm telling you about that, if I'm telling you about a doctor saying, a day after my son is born, we need to get you on birth control now. We don't want you coming back here in 2 months pregnant like you people do. And you don't actually think that's a significant part of my life experience. Maybe I took it personally, I just had a baby, maybe I'm exaggerating, maybe I was emotional, maybe it was the hormones. Well, now there's a divide between us, because this is something that is real in my life, but that I don't necessarily feel you hear. And so these divides are a problem, especially in a family of believers, right? And how do we get past the divides and actually deal with the truths of racial inequality? I certainly don't have the answers. But I will say, Justin gave me this idea when we were talking about what does it mean to respond to the truth? And he said, oh, it just makes me think about Nathan and David. And I won't read this but all the way through, but I love it because Nathan starts off with lots of grace, nice and gentle. He uses a story. I do this when I'm teaching all the time. When I read this, I'm like, this is pedagogy. This is how you teach people, right? I'll tell my students personal stories or stories that from growing up. I'll ease them into thinking about hard truths, right? That people who don't look like you actually get treated dramatically differently than you do. And most of us don't necessarily know that unless we've experienced it. And we may not even believe it. It may sound like victim mentality or whining or complaining. And so Nathan kind of eases David into this hard truth. And then David gets irate about it. And then Nathan says, you are the man. This is you, right? And so the point here isn't for me to say, you are the man, you are all racist, right? But the point is to say, we're all living in a society that is characterized by these deep divisions. And so we're implicated. And certainly we're called to respond, right? Even if you're like, but I've never said a racist word in my life, and I've never thought a racist thing in my life. You're still part of this community, part of this society, part of this system. And I would say that we're still called to respond. It doesn't mean that everyone will respond in the same way, right? It doesn't mean like you're called, you got to go get out there on the street, do what I'm doing, right? But it means in some level, we have to contend with the truths of racial discrimination in our society, is what I think, at least. So I think in a couple ways, and I'm rounding out here, I promise. First, about personal responses, if we think about response. And maybe I'll start with the do's, which is, what do I do once I realize, wow, this is something that's important. This is something that is affecting people. Maybe I know a lot about it. Maybe I don't know. Maybe I think I know, but I really don't. Listening is important no matter which of those categories you're in. And it's a first step, right? It's part of what we're all doing right now. Learning is another. If you're like, wow, I never heard of any of these things that Jamila talked about tonight, well, that suggests there's some room for learning. Or if you're like, some of these things I really don't know what they are or why they would matter. It means that there's room there for understanding the world better, and in that way, understanding each other better and being able to just to learn and love more. And then I would say leaning into discomfort. You know, a lot of times when I'm teaching about race in my classes, you know, it's Cornell. Most of the students are white. Most of them are pretty wealthy and just have come from a completely different background than me, and get very uncomfortable with me being the person in front of the classroom telling them about race. I'm telling them that racism is real. Some of them are like, of course she thinks so. She's just, you know, she has that victim mentality. I've had students write things like that in my course evaluations, even though I'm literally showing them empirical studies, right? But at the root of that is that they are uncomfortable. And I guess I would just say lean into discomfort, because when you push past it at the other side, is often knowledge that can help you to grow. And then of course, love, because that's important over all of this. Quickly, the don'ts. These are don'ts. I say don't. I'm not telling anyone to do or not to do anything, actually, because that, I don't think that's my place. This is how I think about do's and don'ts for myself. And the don'ts are things that tend to rile me or hurt me when I'm talking to people and they respond in this way. One is deflect, right? Deflect is like, well, what about abortion and all of those Black people who are aborting their babies? Or what about Black on Black crime, right? It's like, we can talk about those if you want to talk about those, but we were actually having a conversation about racism. And when you bring up something tangential, it feels like an end run around that conversation, right? It's deflection, distraction, but they're destroying property. What about the property destruction? And it's, I get it. I'm not saying, you know, let's just go and wreak all havoc. But for so many people, not a word when Black people were being killed. And then as soon as a storefront is broken, there's indignation. What that feels like to me is hurtful, because it only mattered when it felt like it was something real to you, right? And I'm not judging that that's what's in anyone's heart, but I'm saying that's how it feels to me, right? The other one is diminishing. Oh, everybody suffers. All groups have suffered. Black people, white people, men, women, it happens everywhere all the time. So we don't have to pay that much attention to your suffering that's really happening right now, because everybody suffers. Well, that feels like you're diminishing something that's very real for me. I've been pulled over by the police 5 times in the last few years. Most of you probably don't know that, because I don't talk to many people about it. Because I don't want people to say, oh, it's no big deal. They probably were just routine stops. Really? Because I'm afraid every time for my life. And if you don't feel that way and you diminish it, it makes it hard for me to want to share that and for me to be able to be real with you, you know? And then demand. Well, fine, prove it to me. Show me all the evidence. Tell me about every little traumatic experience you've had, and maybe you can win me over. Maybe. Maybe not, but maybe. Try me. Relive all of your trauma, and then we'll see. Now, of course, that's not what people intend, I would imagine, most of the time. And there's grace, which means benefit of the doubt. But this is how it feels when there's deflection and distraction and diminishment and demand. It feels hurtful, right? So those are things that can be avoided for more productive conversation. And this is the last slide, I promise. Besides just those individual responses that are about our interpersonal interactions and relationships, there are also general things that it's okay for us to think about, right? It's okay for us to pay attention to what's happening in the world and try to understand where we might fit in as part of the problem. It's okay for us to speak up if you hear family members or coworkers or friends say things that you know are part of the problem. It's really tempting, I bet, just to not say anything, but it's okay and preferable to speak up. And to look beyond politics. It might be like, oh, these sound like things a Democrat would say. Oh, I bet she's a Democrat. It is not about that. Whether you like Fox News or CNN or MSNBC or whatever, you're a liberal, conservative, this goes beyond that. And when we look beyond that, we can pull ourselves out of the divisions that often stop us from being able to understand each other. some specific practicals that I'll end with. And this is part of the pay attention piece. You know, do we know things like who our local district attorney is? These people have immense power over what happens, for example, when there's police misconduct, or over all kinds of decisions that shape things like that chart I showed you about mass incarceration, right? And they're usually elected in local elections that often are nonpartisan. So you don't have to like not vote for whoever your party candidate is. And you could still think about, wow, maybe I should pay attention to whether the DA cares about racial justice, right? Same thing with your local elected officials. Sheriffs are actually elected in most places. Your local sheriff is elected. And you can look at that person's record and be like, wow, they have never prosecuted or arrested someone for X kind of crime that we know is contributing to this problem of racial injustice. Things like your local school board. Schools tend to be places that are deeply segregated. And by paying attention to who's on the board and what their values are and whether they care about equality, we can actually maybe change some things. Even relevant legislation. I don't know who's ever heard of Repeal 50A. This is a piece of legislation that is being hotly contested in New York State right now. It has been for about the last year. 50A says, we don't really have to tell the public anything about police officers, their record, when they do things wrong and there are complaints about them, what the responses to those complaints are, whether they're disciplined. They can operate under a cloak of secrecy. Now, I'm not targeting police and saying they're the problem, because I actually think it's much bigger than that. But if you believe, actually, I think transparency and accountability make more sense in this context. That's something that you can easily send a 2-line email to your elected representative about. Now, you may say, this is not really my thing. I'm not into this stuff, and that's fine, because there's all kinds of ways that we can look around us and think about how to engage. I'll end with this. Did anyone know that Syracuse was named one of the worst cities for Black Americans to live in? Syracuse is one of the top 10 worst cities for Black people to live in. I think it has the dubious distinction of being number 8. Why? If we live here, do we know how other people who live here are experiencing this place and why? And what we can do, right? There are all sorts of opportunities to do something, right? And they don't have to be these practicals. They can be, someone reached out to me from a program in Syracuse that was about tutoring children whose parents had been incarcerated to ask me for advice about something around the program. There are so many things like that that are direct ways to engage with communities that have been at the losing end of these injustices. And there are just so many options for how we can respond. And all of them involve love, loving each other here in this fellowship and loving beyond ourselves in a world that is suffering because of these injustices. I went way over time, so I'm gonna stop. Thank you for tolerating that, JC. I'm gonna stop my share too. I just have to get to it.
Tolerated. That was so great, Jamila. I really appreciate everything that you shared, and all the practicals, do's and don'ts, and your heart in it. And one thing I really appreciate about Jamila is she is a Black woman who is involved in not just this research, but in people who are in places where they've had injustice or felt that inequality. She served in prisons and helped people like that. But when she comes and talks to us about it, she's just, these are the facts. This is how it's experienced me. I want to help you. You're amazing, because you've soaked up all this stuff that you could be like a volcano, but the Holy Spirit is using it for something to help us to understand and do something different. So I definitely don't want to talk much more. If you have any questions, Jamila, we have 46 devices connected. What would you like to do? Would you like to try people raising their hands, or is it better through the chat?
I think we can try hands, but then because I can't fit everyone on one screen, if you feel like, well, how come she hasn't called me yet? If you feel like I might not be seeing your hand, then maybe put it in the chat. That way it just jumps up onto my radar.
So what I'll do, Jamila, is right now you're right next to me. I'll go to the other screen, and if I see someone's hand and you haven't called on someone, I will let you know. I'll just leave my microphone unmuted. I see Mitch and Hope have their hand raised already. So why don't we try it like that for a bit? And guys, please ask Jamila whatever's on your heart. You don't have to know everything. It's actually better if you don't know anything. You're like, hey, can you help me out here? I don't know anything. That's fine as well.
All right, maybe we can start with Mitch and Hope then, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, we miss you guys a ton. So good to see you guys.
Thank you so much.
It's very helpful. Thank you so much, Jamila. I think my question was just kind of on how you're saying that, you know, reaching out to there's a lot of specific things that we can do, including the things that you mentioned in terms of like our local area, or like tutoring children whose parents are incarcerated. Are there any other things that like you've found outside of these things that are also helpful too? Because I think a lot of times that's where we feel at a loss, is like we don't always know how to help or what to do. So this has been extremely helpful because it's practical and it's realistic to be able to achieve it. So I was just curious if there are any other things that come to mind for you that are helpful in terms of what to do.
Yeah, that's great. I think, yeah, practicals are so important. So I guess one thing I would say is, I guess I'd give you two ways of getting to that answer, like process-wise. So one is like, when we first moved to Ithaca, I didn't know anything about what was happening here and how I might be able to like contribute and be a productive part of the community. And some of that I figured out like because of working at Cornell, but some of it I figured out just by like finding a local group and like saying, hey, this is an issue that I know is a problem, like, and this group is working on the issue. So in this area, there's an organization called the Ultimate Reentry Opportunity, and they help people who have been to prison and are reentering into the community and who often have all kinds of challenges and disadvantages. And I remember like figuring out about that group and just showing up at one of their meetings and just sitting and listening. And I did that for a few months, and I got a more clear sense of like what the real challenges in this community are and how I could be a part of changing them. Similarly, you know, I heard when before I first got here that Cornell had a prison education program, and I was like, oh, that's interesting. And at some point I just decided, why should I just teach my students on campus who are great, but who have all the privileges and advantages in the world? And I could also go and teach people in prison. And so what I would say is this, like when you're actually looking for these opportunities and you go to the places where there are also people who are attempting to serve and do good, often doors open. At the very least, I would say, so there's a database online called GuideStar, and you could look up an organization based on what it does. So say you're like, wow, I'm really, who's working on poverty in Syracuse, right? You could go to GuideStar, you could put Syracuse, New York, and you could put poverty, and all these organizations that do work related to that will pop up, right? And then it'll be like, oh, okay, well, you could think about all kinds of ways of getting involved then, like, well, what's closest to me and where might I be able to make the most impact? And the other thing I would say is that most of the time you can make an impact where you are, right? So for me, like I'm a parent, so I'm interacting with the school all of the time, right? There are all kinds of inequalities embedded in our educational system. If I want to help and I say to someone in the school, like, you know, are there needs that children who are living in poverty in this school have, right? Are there opportunities for volunteering, not just volunteering for the fun things, you know, like, oh, go to the football game, I love that. No, I'm not targeting anyone. It's just an example, the first one that came to my mind. But also thinking like, what about the not fun things, you know? Or when something emerges, thinking about it in terms of not just what it means for you, but what it means for maybe the people who don't have very much. So one example is, you know, up the street from our house, they were like, we're gonna build mixed income housing. And a lot of people are like, no. Mixed income housing means we're gonna let poor people come here. Our property values are gonna go down. We're gonna bring in the wrong element. Okay, I don't begrudge anyone their opinion on that. But what happens if everywhere we think like that? Well, what happens is segregation, economic and racial segregation. People only live around people who look like them and who are of their same status. And those things are like primary drivers of racial inequality. So even if you're not out there looking for organizations to volunteer in and going and saying, I want to be on the PTA, if you're just paying attention to what's happening in your community, and when something pops up that you can be a voice around, instead of thinking, well, what's best for my property values? What makes me feel the most safe walking down the street? Which is, of course, it's wonderful to feel safe, but also to think, what might actually be a part of the solution for other people who have less than I do or who are suffering because of various injustices? So that was too long. I'll try to have shorter answers going forward.
Hey, Sybil, I got Joe and Sybil. I mean, Joe and Sybil. Hey, Jamila, I got Joe and Sybil who had a question.
So working in the school district, I see, because we've gone around and we've delivered, like during the Christmas time, we've delivered Christmas baskets and Thanksgiving baskets, and to go around the South Side and to see how much that area is deteriorating. It's almost alarming, because like when you go to someone's house and they don't even have their door, they open the door and the door falls off the hinges when their door opens. It's just, it's heartbreaking. So I'm just wondering, like, and also back when they built 81, I know that kind of displaced a lot of people of color, and it really caused a lot of stuff. Now that they're planning on taking it out, what is that going to do for that community? And what is your viewpoint on, like, how some cities, they'll put money in some areas of the city while other areas of the city just keep deteriorating?
Yeah, those are great questions, Joe. And you mentioned the highway. I will just say to anyone who maybe is a geek and is interested in this stuff, there's a great book called The Road to Inequality. And it is actually all about how highways, by and large, were like tools of racial inequality. And they were often built right through sections of town that would separate Black people from white people, and often that would separate Black people then from resources and from jobs and from stores and things like that. So highways are, it's just like, oh, it's just a highway, but actually it's not just a highway if you pay attention historically to how and why these things were built. But Joe, I think you point to something which is really important, which is like there's lots of inequality that we can see hyper locally just driving around. I mean, Syracuse has one of the highest rates of Black poverty in the country. It's a city that's known as being hyper segregated. So not just segregated, because pretty much everywhere is segregated, but hyper segregated. It's one of the worst examples of segregation in the country, both with respect to race and with respect to poverty. So it's like poor Black people are completely hived off from the rest of the city for the most part. And that just creates opportunities for all kinds of deprivation, honestly. But what that means is that, like, while those areas are deprived, they tend to be out of sight, or we can just drive through them, lock our doors, feel sort of uncomfortable, breathe a sigh of relief when we make it through. And meanwhile, resources are being directed in other places, often to some of us. And so I think, I'm a political scientist, I will admit this. So I tend to think about change on a kind of institutional level, and that might not be where people are at. So you might feel like, I don't want to go out and try to like change all of Syracuse. I just want to think about fixing this problem. And it's telling me my internet connection is unstable. Okay, it's better now. So if you're on that kind of, if you're like, I want to think about what I can do as an individual that doesn't involve any kind of grander scheme, then I think getting involved in kind of like local nonprofits and philanthropic organizations is the best route. But if you're like, wait a minute, why are all these resources going over here and not over there? Well, fundamentally underlying that are decisions about budgets and resources. And the only way you have say over those decisions is if you push the decision makers, and if you actually pay attention to those decision makers and push and demand for different kinds of decisions to be made. You know, when that mixed income housing place that I was telling you all about earlier, when the decision was being made over that, I was really passionate about it, and I told Justin all about it, and I kind of got him a little riled up, and he started going to the local meetings where they were talking about them. And do you know, it was like him and 5 people. Nobody was there. And he was able to like say his piece, you know? And so you'd be surprised, a lot of people look and they see these things as wrong, but they don't do anything about it. And so it just keeps happening. And the benefit of getting involved is that even if you do a little, I think Justin went to like 4 meetings, you can make an impact because hardly anybody is doing anything. And I know that's a high bar because like life is busy and overwhelming, and I feel that every single day. So not everybody can go to the meetings or do the thing. I guess it's just a matter of figuring out, in my sphere, what is my capacity? And within that capacity, what can I do? And what are my gifts? I'm like, my gift is teaching. I can go and I can teach in prison, you know? Not everybody can do that. Not everybody wants to. The number of people that said like, oh my gosh, I get nervous just thinking about you being inside one of those places. And I'm like, oh, they're fine. My students are great. The power went out in prison once. We were in the dark room I was in a dark room with 20, like, you know, people who were in a max security prison. I felt totally safe. That's like, my faith lets me do that. And my talents and capacity let me do that. I guess we all have to figure out what our faith and capacity lets us do. But I don't believe that if we're really looking, God won't reveal it to us. I think he will.
Amen. Amen. Thanks, Joe. Hey, we have a sister from the Great Northwest, Sarah Balvis, a new mom. Yes. And Shiloh and I served on a Hope Youth Corps with Sarah and her husband, Austin. And glad to have you with us tonight, Sarah. Your phone is muted, but she's next up. She's all the way here from the Northwest, so we got to have her in here.
Amen. Thank you, Shiloh, so much for letting me know this is going on. Jamila, that was so helpful. I'm so grateful that I was able to listen in on your presentation. My husband and I lead the campus ministry here in Seattle. And so we're working with, you know, a population right now that is all over social media, that is very reacting really emotionally to this. And, you know, here in Seattle, our ministry is predominantly white. Of our 35 students, 9 are Black, either mixed or fully. And a couple of our students, I think, are just having a really hard time knowing how to direct their hurt and their anger. And my husband and I are both white. And so we're having a hard time knowing how to shepherd them in a way that doesn't silence their voice, but also just helps direct them in a godly way. And I definitely have felt leaning more towards the side of just letting them kind of rage. And there's been a lot on our campus group chat, and we've gotten a lot of input from some really mature Black disciples in our church. But I just want to know, especially because you teach college students, what would you say is the best way to help the younger generation right now, both the Black students and the non-Black students, process this in a godly way? Yeah, would just love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, that's great. The fact that you're asking is encouraging to me, because I was a Christian when I was in the campus ministry. Mm-hmm. And I don't know, and there were things that happened then, because there have always been things that happen. And I don't know that I was even comfortable talking about it. I remember having like a handful of sisters that I would like vent my frustrations when some thing or the other, which happened all the time, happen on campus or in the world. But I don't think, and it's not that our ministry leaders weren't great, they were. I just didn't think that they would understand. And maybe I thought that there would be some attempt to sort of police my emotions or my reaction, which, so I think first, I think it's awesome that you're seeking advice because no one has all the answers. I certainly don't. It's difficult. I find it difficult now, and I feel old sort of being on the other side and interacting with students all the time. Because sometimes I'm like, oh my gosh, okay, calm down. And I find myself thinking like in ways that could be diminishing or dismissive, you know? And I have to sort of like check myself. And so the first thing I try to do is give students space to like be where they're at. So, you know, I remember like the day after the 2016 election, which, you know, politics, everybody responded differently and felt differently to that. But I can tell you that my students of color on campus were absolutely devastated. It felt like 50% of the country doesn't care if we live or die because they viewed that decision as a threat to them, and we're just deeply hurt. And, you know, it was a long day of like a line of students coming into my office in tears, you know, and I mostly just let them cry and tried to listen and hear them out and initially not really try to come up with a solution. I know that I sometimes get frustrated when people just want to solve the problem because I know it's not that simple or that easy. I know it's deeper than that. And so if they're offering me superficial solutions, it feels inadequate to the task. And it's really easy to sniff that out. I often tell students that's what I'm doing though, because if you try to listen without articulating that that's your intention, it can feel like you're indifferent. And so I'll often say, you know what, you know, I had a lot of students, for example, whose parents were immigrants and who were deeply worried about their family members being deported. And my parents are immigrants, but my parents now are naturalized, you know, so they're not at risk of being deported. So there's a way I don't understand what they're going through. And I would say, you know what, I can see that you're hurt. This is so important. This is so hard. I am not in your situation. So I just want to listen. I just want to be here to hear what you're going through. I would try not to poke and prod with a lot of questions because sometimes that can feel a little like the demanding, right? Prove to me that this is really as bad as you think it is, you know? And not to be too sensitive to, even though with my Cornell students, they're not necessarily Christians, right? So I'm not going to be like, you need to be more loving and kind and, you know, although I'll often try to get that across because those are the principles that I believe in, right? But sometimes there are other things that come out besides that. My husband, who is, I think, somewhere on here, I don't know where he is, but I am always venting to him about this stuff. We've been married for almost 16 years now, but we've known each other since campus. So it's 18, 19 years now. He's been hearing me like, ah, and often he just listens. And when we first got married, he used to try to find a solution, and it actually drove me crazy and would be the source of a lot of our issues. The other thing, and maybe this is the last thing I'll say, so I don't go on too long, but which is like, I would say that the next steps and the solutions could be co-produced with you and those students, especially the students who are experiencing the problem. So I think what would cause me to sort of respond probably with less patience than I should have to my husband when I felt like he was trying to solve the problem was this feeling that someone who isn't experiencing, he's white, I should say, in case you don't know, who isn't experiencing this, who isn't going through this, is kind of try to sweep in and be my savior. You know, there's this idea of like the white savior complex, you know, and it's like, no, I don't need you to do that. I just need you to hear me. But often when I got past that point of that criticalness in my heart, and when he got past the point of trying to fix everything, we could together develop ways of moving forward. Those students have, you know, when they get past the intensity of their emotions, and they will, and on their own schedule at their own pace, right, they will be able to think through what might help for them. Do we do a book club where we read and think and learn and talk about these things together? Do you 9 students do a book club because you need a really, and I know people don't like this idea, but a really safe space? And what that means is you could say what you're really thinking without somebody saying, oh no, I feel accused. I feel like no, I don't have to worry about anybody's feelings. We can just be honest. Maybe they need that. Maybe, but they may have ideas about what they need. And then there may be some ideas that you don't have and that they do, and ideas that they don't have that you do. And so if you think of them as like partners in this with you, you can develop solutions with them as opposed to for them. And then that feels less like paternalistic and more like we're partners in this together.
Amen. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Hey, Jamila, we have Leslie on the second page here as well.
Oh, okay.
And she had a question. She sent it through the chat. She said,
Okay.
what are your thoughts on protests?
Oh, okay. You know, I guess this can be controversial for some people. I think protests are fine. I think that not just fine, but important. So maybe I'll start with the easiest thing, which is the social science research. And what the social science research says is that protests are actually vital. That turning points, especially with respect to race, that major turning points in this country's history have happened after massive disruptive protests, right? The whole point of protest is to disrupt. Right. So yes, it's inconvenient, and your donut shop you can't get to, and the street you want to drive down you can't get to. So on a personal level, it is just inconvenient and okay. So I understand why people might respond negatively to that. Now I'm talking about protests now. But the point is for it to be inconvenient, because unless I make your life hard, you're not going to pay attention to me. Now, as like members of a kind of Christian family, we should pay attention to each other without that, right? I shouldn't have to protest JC for him to like listen to me. And I don't feel like I do. But on a society-wide level, often the only way to see change happen is to make a lot of noise. There's a whole book that a colleague and friend of mine at the University of Pennsylvania, his name is Dan Gillian, he wrote a whole book on this. And it really supports the idea that protests are an effective mechanism of change. Now, there are different kinds of protests. There are violent protests, there are nonviolent protests. You know, as a Christian, I am not a person of violence, and I would prefer for protests to be nonviolent. I will say that the research suggests that violent protests are sometimes just as, if not more effective than nonviolent protests. So there is a logic to it and a rationale from the perspective of, you know, the world that makes sense. People are frustrated, they're tired of it, they want something to happen. This is one way of pushing for that. I think from a Christian perspective, it's not a matter of whether protesting is right or wrong. It's a matter of, you know, whether it's within our faith, what we want to do, what we feel, you know, God, how we feel God can use us, or what have you. And I know that people may differ. I don't know if this is a disputable matter. If it is, it is. But I think that protests are fine. And I think that I've participated in protests before, and I've done it righteously. And so it's completely possible to do. And I've done it because I believe that it mattered and I wanted to speak up. That's not how everybody wants to speak up. And there's no judgment, like if you don't go to a protest, there's something wrong with you. But I also don't think, my opinion is that there shouldn't be judgment the other way either, which is that if you do go, then there's something wrong with you.
Yeah. Oh, Jamila mentioned disputable matters there. I think that could be a disputable matter. And so, however, I would say if you looked at Acts chapter 6, since we are still a church, if you looked at Acts chapter 6, when the disciples were increasing, it says the Hellenistic Jews complained against the Hebraic Jews because they felt like their widows weren't getting noticed, and then their widows got noticed. So, so I think you can see even in the Bible that you have to, the squeaky wheel gets a little bit of grease there. I think that.
I would have never thought of that. Some of you are asking for the book. I'm going to pull up the link right now, and I'm going to send it to you.
Amen. Danielle Box, and then I'm sorry, I've got Danielle, and then Justin, and then we'll have Jordan and Emily there.
Justin, he's married to me.
He never gets tired of talking to you.
He can ask a question anytime.
Hey, so I just wanted to say thank you so much. This was amazing. I really appreciate you putting this together for all of us. My question is kind of like almost like what next? For me, and also this is not directed to Ronnie because he was saying like, oh, people are going to think you're talking about me. But actually, as you know, like he works, you know, kind of in a lot of the stuff that you were talking about. So he knows a lot. But I've had a lot of friends and family members who are not minorities reach out to me kind of asking like what they could do to help, or, you know, what, you know, just to understand more. And I know for me, you know, as you and I were just talking the other day, like I just felt so emotional about everything. So it's been kind of hard to answer that question, but I guess I just kind of wanted to know, like, what would your answer be, you know, if someone who wasn't a minority would ask, like, where do I start? Like, how can I help?
Yeah, I think that's great, Danielle. So one of the first things I do is just direct people to resources other than myself. And maybe I'll put some links to books and different things in the chat. But part of the reason why I do that is because it can get really overwhelming. I was reading this Wall Street Journal article the other day that was like 10 things white people can do to help or whatever. Did you guys read it? Oh, you looked at each other. I was wondering if you read it. And like one of them was like, call your Black friends to see if they're okay. And the other one was like, talk to your Black friend and have a conversation with them about race. And I was like, oh my gosh, a tsunami of phone calls and conversations will be coming my way. Everybody is going to find the Black friend. And this is especially if you live in a place like we do, in a predominantly white community where you're like 50 people's Black friend. It's like, oh my gosh. So I try to identify resources that I can point people to, because I can't be everybody's resource, right? Especially because some people, like, they sort of want to learn and they reach out and they're like, what should I do? But then once you actually get into the weeds, they're like very resistant. And then it's like, that takes an emotional toll on you that I think most people cannot understand or don't predict. Like, they think, I am so good. I asked my Black friend what I should do. And it never occurs to them that like maybe 20 other people asked your Black friend too. And by the time they got to you, they were so exasperated. And then you're like, why does Danielle seem like she doesn't have any patience with me, you know? So just, I'm happy to send resources, just things that people can access easily. Like, here are some things to read if you want to read about what's happening and understand it better. Here are some like webinars or videos you can watch, because this can help you get a better grasp on this. Just tools to allow people to learn themselves. One of the things I always tell people is the first thing you can do is learn. The first thing you can do is learn, because you can't understand the appropriate way to respond unless you learn. And so I can help give you resources for learning. I can't take you all the way down the path and tell you every step. Part of the whole idea is that when you're invested in this, you do the work to figure that out yourself, right? You don't say, hey, Black person, now you do the work of fixing racism. Tell me what to do, right? Because in many ways, there's already the work of enduring it, right? So then if on top of it, you have the work of fixing it and showing everybody else how to fix it, that's overwhelming. But of course, we also want to be loving and giving and help people when they come to us for help. So I have like a kind of little toolbox of resources, and I say, here are ways that you can learn. That's the first step. As you learn, pay attention so you can figure out what you should do. But you can't necessarily figure that out for people.
Amen.
That's good.
Jamila, thank you so much. We're going to keep with questions here, but speaking of not doing too much, thanks for doing tonight. Jamila, if you'll give me the resources, I'll send it out on our Remind. I'll put it along with this YouTube. I'll put a link to something and on our Facebook page as well. So I will disseminate that information from Jamila, and you can drink as deeply of it as you like there. So.
And one caveat, that if I recommend an article or a book or something, it doesn't mean everything in it like I'm 100% on board with, right? It means I learned something from this. Maybe you can too, right?
Amen. And like most of us, and Justin, make sure you have your dictionary with you when you read the articles and books that Dr. Michener sends out to you. I had to look up denizen. I haven't thought about denizen for a while, an important difference between denizen and citizen. Anyway, Jordan, why don't you share, you and Emily had a question there.
Oh, I thought the husband was going to answer. It's all good.
Yes, thank you for this. We took a lot of notes, and we're already looking up articles because, you know, he's looking up articles.
He has a head start, people. Do you have the PhD in hand yet? If not,
But one of the things that I've been encouraged by just my social media. Like, I feel like a lot of my friends are understanding, and they're really seeing the need to speak up and do all that, which I'm grateful for. But there's definitely the few out there that are kind of like, they are dismissing by talking about the property. They are talking about Black on Black crimes and just totally. And so in my mind, so what I'm having a hard time with, like, I'm grateful for my friends and who are like, going out there and doing stuff. But then I feel like the ones that aren't seeing it are the ones I actually need to talk to. But I do not know how to approach them because they already kind of have this stance, and they don't seem like they want to listen, and they don't see the need to listen. I think that's where I'm having a hard time. I was wondering if you had an input about how to, I don't know. I just don't know what to do. Like, if there's something I could do, or with people. Like,
oh, it's so hard. And I love your heart that you're like, wait a minute, I want to find the people who I think most need this. And, I don't want to preach to the choir. I actually want to make a difference by trying to influence and engage people who maybe really need this, but don't recognize they do. I love that heart. I think it's possible sometimes. I will be honest. I think that many times it's not possible ever. But what I've learned is in the moment when I really, really want to help somebody or engage them, that's not necessarily the moment when they can receive it. Like that, those things aren't always aligned. And so, I'll give you an example just from my students. So I had a student who I taught my very first year at Cornell, and it was a class on poverty. And we talked a lot about race because race and poverty are very much interconnected in this country. And the student sat there glaring at me all class long, clearly did not want to be there, was just not feeling me or anything about the class. Every way you could make that clear to somebody through your body language, verbal, nonverbal, he made it clear. Wow. And at the end of the semester, I had an evaluation. They're anonymous. I don't know that it was the student, but there was one evaluation that was particularly vitriolic, that was just, she doesn't know anything. All she does is whine about race. She probably got this job because of affirmative action, and now I have to sit here and listen to her whine about race. It was just so hurtful, right? And I remember being hurt that I had come to that class really wanting to teach and really hoping that everybody was in a place where they could learn, and encountering a student who just was not in a place where they could learn, right? Fast forward 3.5 years, the student takes a class with me again. And I'm like, why are you here? Like, it didn't work out before. Let's not do this to each other again, This time it was a class on prisons. Surprise! We talk about race all the time. It's like, I'm just obsessed with race. And it was so completely different. And towards the end of the class, the student came to my office hours and said, the first year I took that class with you, I hated it. It was so uncomfortable. It made me feel scared that this was really the world. How could this really be the world? And I didn't know it. How could it be the world? My parents don't know it. This stuff just can't be true. Nobody in my life seems to be living this way. And he couldn't handle it. And 3.5 years later, he could. And he took that class and loved it. And we maintained a relationship going forward after that. But the time where I thought I could help him was not when I could help him. It needed to be at a time when our ability to engage each other could align. So I think you have to honestly assess whether this is a time when we can engage in alignment and this can be productive. If it's not, there's no like magic formula to determining that. But I will say that if it's not that time, it will be like banging your head into a concrete wall, or, throwing your pearls to pigs, whatever biblical or non-biblical analogy you want to use. It will be very hard, and it'll take an emotional toll on you that'll make it harder for you to engage the next person, because now you've been so beaten down. So for the people who you feel like are just way out there and you just don't really think anything can get through, I would say, like, engage them and love them, but not in that way. There are plenty of people who say things to me and I'm like, whoa, that sounds crazy to me. Okay, let me just figure out where I can love you. And that's where we're going to be right now. And then if I feel like God gives me an opening, I might be able to go there, you know?
Thank you. That was really helpful.
Yeah. So we have one question from Facebook, and I really appreciate it. And what they've asked is, hey, I don't know what to do. What would you say? Would it be good to send Black people that we are in our neighborhood or in our congregation just encouraging notes or a little gift? I know they don't want pity. I just want to send love. Would that be okay? Would it be better if it's an anonymous gift? So it's kind of a practical, tangible thought there of encouragement.
That's really interesting. I will say it's not something I've ever thought about. So I guess that's a caveat.
You stumped the professor.
I will say this, like, one thing to remember about Black people is that they're like not a singular homogeneous group, you know? Like, I was talking to Danielle on Sunday. We had a great conversation. I was so happy that she called me, or maybe I called her, whatever, that we talked. And it was like, wow, we have a lot in common. And then also like, wow, we have a lot not in common, you know? And so it may be that I think it's probably impossible for me to tell how your neighbors might respond to that. Like, if it were me, I'd be like, awesome. Like, our neighbors actually texted Justin today and said, oh, you guys want to go to the drive-in movie theater, like in our cars? Like, we're not going to interact, we're social distancing, but we can drive there together and know that we're both there. And I kind of thought, how nice. Like, during this time when there's so much division, I love that my white neighbors just asked to do something. And they don't always do that, but it was nice. If I got like a gift in the mail, someone actually sent me an email today and said, I want to bring you something. Can you give me your address? I'll give her my address. I think it's sweet. I can imagine a time in my life when I would not have responded to that, when I would have found that condescending, like, okay, I'll just endure racism and you give me a nice little treat and it makes everything feel better, you know? Or I might have thought, well, so you're going to do this and feel better about yourself, but keep going to work and like giving all the diversity work to the people of color and like giving, you know, doing the little things that you probably do that are like, I could totally plug into that like really critical perspective on something like that, or I could not. And there's almost no way to tell. I guess I would say do whatever you do out of faith. And then the response is neither here nor there. If it's coming from a place of faith and love, it's the most that you can do.
I really appreciate that response, Jamila. Hey, I'm gonna mute my microphone, but I'd love for us all to show our hands and give Dr. Michener there a round of applause. Justin's question was already answered, so yeah, let's give Dr. Michener a round of applause. We are so grateful. We're not kicking anybody out, but what I do want to do is say a prayer here, and so I'm going to close out our service part of it. If you want to stick around and ask Dr. Michener a question, is that all right, Jamila?
Yeah,
a few more folks.
Right.
Okay. I think you've answered a lot of questions here, but we can enjoy some fellowship. If anyone has a question here, we'll do that. But Jamila, we are grateful as a church and as people who are visiting here. But I am just personally so grateful for you spending tonight. Yes. And you were absolutely right. The lesson that you gave us was succinct. It was powerful. It was important. But the questions you just answered and the resources you're going to give and really hearts that you've opened up in some ways are going to be so blessed by this. So thank you. One more time, one more round of applause for Dr. Michener. We're super grateful to have her here. And I'm going to say a prayer here. And then whoever wants to jump off, you've been hanging on because you're like, Jamila might answer one more thing. If you don't have a question, enjoy your evening, but you can stick around and someone else might have some good questions for Jamila.